This is episode 9 of the Creator-God Theory of the Atonement. I've titled it, Taking Full and Complete Ownership and the Forgotten Law of Corporate Accountability. In this episode, we'll show how the Creator-God Theory restores the long-forgotten law of corporate accountability, the principle that to create is to own is to be responsible, and to be responsible is to be accountable. This principle reveals that when the Creator God bears the burden of His creations, divine justice is not compromised but completed, for it is this very accountability that stands as the fulfillment, not the violation, of divine justice. And that brings us directly back to where we left off in our last episode, to the two halves of the atonement crisis that have long perplexed Christian thought. The injustice accusation, its vicarious nature, appears to violate the foundational principles of justice, and the incoherence problem. Its infinite nature appears to violate the eternal laws of identity and causality. We also introduced their matching solutions, the two halves of the atonement solution. The divine accountability principle, which asserts that it is not unjust to hold the Creator God accountable for His creations, and the divine potentiality principle, which asserts that it is not incoherent for the Creator God's redemptive power to be potentially, rather than actually, infinite. Two problems, two solutions, one coherent theory. In this episode, we take up the first half of that crisis, the moral half, the injustice accusation, which claims that the vicarious nature of the atonement violates the foundational principles of justice, especially the innocence and substitution principles, that it is unjust for the innocent to suffer or to be substituted for the guilty. We will argue that once the divine accountability principle is understood, it becomes clear that it is not unjust to hold the Creator God accountable for His creations, and, in fact, that this very accountability is the fulfillment, not the violation, of divine justice. But that immediately raises a deeper question, one that lies beneath everything we've said so far. If God is to be held accountable for His creations, who or what holds God Himself accountable? The answer to that question forms the ultimate foundation of the Creator-God theory of the atonement because it defines the moral and ontological framework in which both God and man exist. In short, accountability is a derivative concept, not a primary one. Like justice and mercy, and like grace and works, it presupposes something deeper, a reality-based framework that gives meaning and coherence to them all. This framework has been with us from the beginning, though often only implicitly. Before we go further, let's make it explicit by returning to a familiar slide from episode 4, the three foundational aspects of the restored gospel. You'll recall that we identified the three foundational aspects of the gospel as its Christ-centered nature, emphasizing grace, its covenant-based nature, emphasizing works, and its reality-based nature, grounding the gospel in truth. Now we can add an important insight from our last episode. It is precisely this union of grace and works that harmonizes justice and mercy. And it is the underlying eternal realities, the eternal laws, truths, and principles that constitute the reality-based nature of the restored gospel. As Elder John A. Whitsoes observed, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints deals with eternal realities. And further, the doctrines of the gospel are of an unchanging nature. They are eternal realities. These eternal realities form the foundation upon which all true doctrine and all true accountability must rest. Which brings us to the central question before us. Who or what holds God accountable? Two ontological starting points, and from them flow two entirely different theological worldviews. In the traditional Christian worldview, everything begins with God, the source and author of all things. From God comes creation, the bringing of all existence into being. Then comes the fall, the moment when humanity departs from divine will. To remedy that separation comes the atonement, where Christ reconciles mankind back to God. And finally, the promise of salvation made possible through that redemptive act. It's a sequence most of us recognize, one that seems complete at first glance. But as we'll see, it rests on an assumption that changes everything, the belief that reality itself begins with God. The restored gospel worldview begins one step earlier. It begins with eternal realities, the uncreated laws, truths, and principles that form the very structure of existence. From within that eternal framework arises God perfectly aligned with those realities and operating in harmony with them. Then comes creation, not ex nihilo, but by organizing eternal matter and intelligences within divine law. The fall follows, the necessary condition for growth, agency, and redemption. Then, the atonement, where the Creator takes full accountability for his creations. And finally, salvation of all who freely align themselves with those eternal realities. In short, everything the restored gospel teaches about grace, works, justice, and mercy is grounded not in divine decree, but in divine harmony with reality itself. On the next slide, we'll take a closer look at the core claims of each of these two theological worldviews and see how their very starting points change everything that follows, including whether it's even possible to hold God accountable for his creations. Let's start with the traditional Christian worldview. In that view, reality originates in divine will. Existence itself depends on what God chooses to create and sustain. But in the restored gospel worldview, reality is co-eternal and law-governed. Matter, truth, and intelligence simply are. God works within them, not apart from them. Or, as Elder John A. Whitsoe explained, whatever is the ultimate reality is eternal. Matter, as we know it, and which forms the earth, is made from eternal elements. In that sense, the formation of the earth was an organization rather than a creation. In the traditional view, law and morality are divine declarations. Right and wrong are declared, not discovered. In the restored view, law and morality are eternal realities. Right and wrong are discovered, not declared. Or as Elder Kenneth Johnson put it is important to understand that natural laws were not determined on the basis of popularity. They were established and rest on the rock of reality. In the traditional view, God is a law unto himself. Reality and morality are whatever he decrees. But in the restored view, God abides by eternal law. Reality and morality are fixed in law, not formed by will. Or as President John Taylor instructed, there are eternal laws that exist with the gods in the eternal worlds, and from which they cannot depart, and to which they are bound in all their acts. All beings, all things, from the great Creator to the minutest form of life, are governed by the law of their existence. And that's where the divide becomes absolute. In one framework, divine will defines reality. In the other, divine integrity fulfills it. In the traditional view, accountability is self-referential. God answers only to himself. No higher law or authority exists. In fact, within that framework, the very idea of holding God accountable doesn't even arise. It's considered nonsensical. God's will is the highest law. Reality and morality are what he declares them to be. But in the restored view, accountability is reality referential. God answers within the eternal laws that sustain his divinity. Or, as Elder John A. Whitsoe stated, one thing seems clear, however, that the Lord, who is a part of the universe in common with all other parts of the universe, is subject to eternal universal laws. And as Elder D. Todd Christofferson confirmed when speaking of God's commandments, his commandments are the voice of reality. So what are the implications for divine accountability? In the traditional Christian worldview, divine will creates reality, and accountability disappears as a meaningful concept. In the restored gospel worldview, divine integrity abides within eternal law, fulfilling all righteousness, and accountability becomes the very expression of divinity itself. In short, God's accountability is not an affront to his divinity. It is the fulfillment and manifestation of it. And that brings us to the next step. Because if divine accountability is real, if even God stands answerable within eternal law, then everything about creation, the fall, and the atonement takes on new meaning. Next, we'll see how that new framework unfolds through the full sequence of divine order, from eternal realities to salvation, We've now arrived at the heart of the Creator-God theory of the Atonement, where divine accountability unfolds in full. Up to this point, we've seen that God operates within the eternal realities that make salvation possible. Now we can introduce the expanded framework, a sequence that shows precisely where the principles of ownership, responsibility, and accountability fit within the divine order. Notice how these three principles are placed between creation and the fall. This positioning gives literal meaning to the phrase we've used throughout this series: my circus, my monkeys, my problem. Each part of that saying gives expression to one of these divine principles. My circus corresponds to ownership, acknowledging one's creations. My monkeys corresponds to responsibility, accepting stewardship over them. My problem corresponds to accountability, standing answerable for their outcomes. Together, these three principles define what it means to be a moral agent and ultimately what it means to be a creator. Hence, my circus plus my monkeys equals my problem. And when the creator claims ownership of his creations, assumes responsibility for their care, and accepts accountability for their redemption, the atonement ceases to be at odds with divine justice. It reveals itself as the very fulfillment of it. Let's look more closely at each principle in turn, beginning with the principle of ownership, my circus. Ownership, in its fullest sense, begins with the self by taking moral possession of one's thoughts, choices, and actions, and then extends outward to include all that one creates, organizes, or lawfully possesses. In the Creator-God theory of the Atonement, this same principle applies to all that God creates or organizes. It marks the first step in divine acknowledgement that this is indeed my circus, my monkeys, and therefore my problem. This leads us to the principle of responsibility. Responsibility, in its fullest sense, is not an addition to ownership. It is its inherent moral property. To own something in any meaningful sense is already to be responsible for its place, outcome, and impact in the world. In the Creator-God theory of the Atonement, this principle reveals the Creator's continual stewardship over his creations. It marks the second step in divine acknowledgement that this is indeed my circus, my monkeys, and therefore my problem. This culminates in the principle of accountability. Accountability, in its fullest sense, follows directly from ownership and responsibility. It is the act of standing answerable for the outcomes of one's choices and creations. It is the willingness to bear the moral consequences of one's own causal power. In the Creator-God theory of the Atonement, accountability is the ultimate expression of divine integrity, the Creator's readiness to answer for the moral and spiritual state of his creations. It marks the final step in divine acknowledgement that this is indeed my circus, my monkeys, and therefore my problem. Up to now, we've explored the principles of ownership, responsibility, and accountability at the individual level, the personal sphere of moral agency that governs our own choices and creations. But the atonement itself does not operate at that level. It functions at a higher, corporate level, the level of divine ownership, responsibility, and accountability exercised by the Creator God, acting within the Godhead as a unified governing body. To truly understand how the atonement works, we must change our vantage point from the individual moral order to the corporate moral order. This is where the forgotten law of corporate accountability comes to the forefront and compels us to rethink and reframe our entire understanding of the atonement. It represents nothing less than a shift in the theological framework of the atonement from individual to corporate accountability, and that shift changes everything. For when viewed only from the individual level, the atonement can appear incoherent or unjust. But when viewed from the corporate level, within the Godhead as a unified governing body, it becomes coherent, complete, and morally justifiable. You may be wondering, is there really such a law as corporate accountability? In the legal and civic world, the answer is yes, it's well established. In law and governance, corporate accountability means that a collective entity, such as a corporation, government, or organization, can be held morally and legally responsible for its actions, or the actions of its agents. It rests on one governing idea: authority entails liability. Whoever possesses decision-making power over a system bears responsibility for the outcomes of that system. Modern examples include environmental law, business ethics, and international law, where leadership is held accountable for harm caused under its oversight. Core legal principle. A body corporate is accountable for the acts done within its authority and for the outcomes of its governance. While this law is well known in legal and civic life, it has been almost entirely forgotten in theology. Religious thought has long confined accountability to the individual level, the sinner, the saint, or the soul, while neglecting its corporate dimension at the level of the Godhead as a governing body. And yet this is precisely where it matters most. If creation, the fall, and the atonement are the shared work of a divine unity, the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost, acting as a single governing body with ultimate authority and liability for its actions, then divine justice requires not merely individual, but corporate ownership, responsibility, and accountability. That's why we call it the forgotten law of corporate accountability, forgotten by theologians, not by God. Here then is our summary definition of this corporate law of accountability. Wherever creative or governing power is shared, moral accountability becomes corporate, extending to all who participate in the ownership, oversight, or sustaining of a shared creation. And here is its application to the Creator-God theory. In the Creator-God theory of the atonement, this law finds its highest fulfillment in the Godhead, whose united stewardship over all creation makes the atonement not a legal fiction, but a divine act of corporate accountability, perfectly just, perfectly coherent, and perfectly real. In the next episode, we'll explore that framework in depth under the title, The Godhead as a Moral Corporate Governing Body, with the subtitle, Corporate Ownership, Boundaries, and Collaboration. It is within this sacred covenant of shared ownership and accountability that redemption becomes not only possible, but inevitable, revealing not just how salvation works, but why it could have been accomplished in no other way than through this moral and corporate law of divine accountability.